Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at Selma in 1965 and all the protests surrounding it. Particularly, we'll be focusing on the March from Selma, 1965. The next target for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was voting rights in Alabama. Its governor, George Wallace, was a staunch supporter of segregation. SCLC was well established in Selma, and Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy saw it as the next place that they could make a difference. A march was organised from Selma to Montgomery to highlight the lack of black voting rights. This should be seen in the context of the America after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, although it banned segregation, had several loopholes and weaknesses, notably voting rights. If you're unfamiliar with this act, I'd urge you to watch my rapid revision video on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 before proceeding with this one. But next, let's have a look at the opponents of desegregation, including Alabama Governor George Wallace. State governors like Governor George Wallace of Alabama were in charge of the governments of an individual state. However, they didn't get it all their own way. They still had to answer to federal laws and the US Constitution. We're about to have a look at a section of a speech by George Wallace that was given in 1963, 2 years before the Voting Rights Act and the protests in Selma. Wallace was a staunch segregationist. He was very much in favour of it, and he knew that that made him popular among many voters in Alabama. Partly because, let's remember, very, very few black people could vote in Alabama, so he could get away with saying things like this. I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. What is the tyranny that he's referring to? Well, frankly, the US government, who were trying to desegregate things gradually, especially after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which Governor George Wallace would have very well known was going through Congress at that time. So what happened to combat attitudes like Governor George Wallace and to make change anyway? Well, unfortunately, a lot of bloodshed had to happen first. Probably the most famous single day of the protests around Selma in 1965 happened on March the 7th, what became known as Bloody Sunday. These photographs give us an idea of the violence that was inflicted on protesters. So what actually happened? Martin Luther King had postponed the march from Selma to Montgomery, but nevertheless, on March the 7th, 600 protesters peacefully advanced on the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside Selma. This in itself was quite a symbolic thing. Edmund Pettus, after whom the bridge had been named, was a member of the Confederacy that supported slavery during the Civil War. Montgomery state troopers blocked their path and then charged them with tear gas, horses and batons. Many of the deputies present had been specially deputised from local racist volunteers, so you can imagine how enthusiastic they were to be violent with these protesters. Shocking footage and photographs like the ones you can see here of protesters being savagely beaten, including middle-aged woman Annie Cooper, who's pictured unconscious in the below right, were widely seen. It is miraculous really that nobody was killed. The actions of the state troopers was condemned in both parts of Congress. So what were the outcomes of these scenes? President Johnson, who had already passed the Civil Rights Act, had been dragging his heels somewhat, but he was now prepared to act and realised that he had to. President Johnson gave a speech in support of civil rights, using the phrase associated with the civil rights movement, "We shall overcome." Johnson signed an executive order so that the National Guard could escort marchers all the way to Montgomery from Selma. Hundreds of marchers, black and white, from all over the country took part, and an image of the later march can be seen in the below right. This proved that there was sufficient support for a Voting Rights Act, which was subsequently passed. And you can find out more about that in a later video. I'll have another rapid revision video covering it. But it's also worth bearing in mind that there was a backlash even to this. Several people, including white supporters of desegregation, were murdered in the aftermath of the Selma March. Change could not come quickly enough. Some final points then. Selma was another episode in securing voting rights. Shocking scenes in Selma prompted a public and political response, just as the shocking scenes in Birmingham had done in 1963. As a result, Johnson saw that there was a need for and support for a Voting Rights Act to address the weaknesses of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But more on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in my next rapid revision video. But that's the end of this one. I hope it's been useful to you. If it has, please like the video and subscribe for more. But for now, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.